Here are my latest ruminations on our topic of discussion, which is the big picture thinking routines, thinking, whatever we will call that in any domain, be it language, arts, science, history, physical, athletics, spatial, reasoning, music, visual, whichever it is. Thinking requires synapses and dendrite, or axioms and dendrites with a little synapses across where they squirt the juice, whatever it is, okay? It requires brain cells. To get the things that you've been working on in your head out of your head requires a medium. You have to transmit that thing, however you envision it, out of your head to someone else. Okay, so far so good. To communicate effectively, with precision, exactly what you're thinking requires technique. It requires keyboard skills for a computer. It requires being able to manipulate a pencil. It requires being able to hold a paintbrush. It requires being able to form clay with your hands into something. It requires piano skills if you want to communicate via that medium. It requires vocal training so that you can phonate precisely what you're trying to communicate to get the best possible sound. And that leads us to the question of the best possible sound. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with perfecting sound, perfecting technique, being more precise with the way that you play, that you sing, that you interpret, that you think, all of those things. And yet, let's look at the big picture. And let's look at the big picture from the standpoint of every other form of or domain of education. Let's take language arts. It's an easy one. We all understand it. Most of us have our children of our own, or have brothers and sisters, or have seen kids develop and all of that. So I'm calling on those memories. Here's my little example on refining technique. Everybody struggles with refining technique, perfecting it, making sure it's just right. It's not just us. We're not the bad guys here. Everybody is obsessed with this. Think about this in terms of language arts. Here's an example of a 4-year-old writing a story. The 4-year-old understands that you put words on paper and they go in a linear fashion or horizontal fashion, a manner, from top to bottom. And yet I don't understand any of that scribble. I would have to interpret that I would have to have the 4-year-old interpret it for me, tell me what was going on. Let's move on to a 5-year-old. As you can see, I've highlighted some of the things in green. You can see that these are more like letters. The technique of holding the pencil and writing in a way that sounds like it should sound, or like it should look, is getting better. There's an M, there's the word zoo there, there's the letter I, and then a letter W, and then a complete word, dad. So I don't really know what the whole thing is, but I understand it has to do with zoo and the individual writing and that individual's father. Jump ahead to 6-year-olds. Now we have a relatively complete sentence. Notice how the person had to droop it down the page a bit. I am at the zoo. So here we are at a 7-year-old. Yesterday I went the zoo. She, he, missed 2. Who cares right now? Yesterday I went the zoo and saw a huge elephant. elephant is spelled incorrectly. However, there is a period, so the child knows it's a sentence. Notice that there is a developmental technique process. It is the technique that changes, even though thinking may change too because of synapses. But let's just focus on technique. The difference between the first and the last is a better grasp of technique, a better grasp of vocabulary. We know that children can say many more words than they can spell. We know from experience and research that verbal communication is far beyond written communication. You can say things more easily than you can write things early on in your career, or early on in your life. So what we're looking at here in these 4 frames is a child getting more technical prowess at communicating via writing, holding a pencil, forming not a thought because the thought is there, spelling correctly, and spelling is technique. It's being more precise. Structuring a sentence. In this particular, in the 7-year-old, the sentence is a compound sentence. It has the word "and" in it. So it's not, yesterday I went the zoo, period. I saw a huge elephant. This is a little more sophisticated because of that, the use of the word "and." So we send kids to school to help them master the technique of holding a pencil, learning proper grammar, proper spelling, all of these tools, technique to communicate. The technique and the tools to communicate, what purpose do they serve? They must have a purpose, or we wouldn't spend the money and the time to invest in them. I suggest that the tools children learn to write serve the child's thinking. They are self-serving tools, self-serving technique. Ultimately, the skills gained, the technique gained, all of the precision gained in communicating via the written word that children are forced to endure will help the child communicate effectively. It is the child that is at the center of technique. Technique serves the child. And since we're all about technique in music, because learning a musical instrument or singing correctly, phonating correctly, takes a lot of time and a lot of practice, technique must be important for us. And so we have to ask ourselves, what's the point? Well, to answer that question, there are 2 things to consider. One is technique serves the beauty of sound, the beauty of tone. And that's important to an art that is based on the beauty of sound. We do not want someone to play That's where they start, analogous to a 4-year-old. This is really what we want. That's where we're headed. In building technique, we enrich the sounds that come out of a voice, that come out of the end of an instrument. That's important. along with this idea of increasing someone's ability to make a beautiful sound, whether vocally or on an instrument, there's also the executive skill set, the physical act of manipulating an instrument, or of manipulating your vocal cords, or all of that. So the technical aspect, the executive aspect of holding a pencil, so to speak, or holding the instruments and doing whatever, who does this serve? Who benefits? Who is the ultimate beneficiary of all of this time we spend in getting kids to make a beautiful sound and to learn all of this complicated psychomotor executive skill technique? Who ultimately wins? This, I believe. Technique serves children when they are in the context of ensembles that we or our friends or our colleagues conduct. In this course, I ask you to reflect. Reflecting, deep reflection takes time, and often we're having to reflect on things we don't necessarily want to reflect on. We have to acknowledge where we are. There is nothing wrong necessarily with what we're doing. And yet, the vast majority of people who have played in our ensembles use those famous Jeff Foxworthy words, "I used to could." I believe we do not need a nation of used to coulds. We need a nation of I am doing. There is nothing wrong with the way we approach music education if we can acknowledge at the same time that 80 to 90% of the children in our country choose not to be in our music programs. For me, that's simply not good enough. I again am looking at the huge picture, and I have the luxury of doing that in my position here. However, think about the big picture. Most of the students that you see right now who are active in your ensembles will not be so once real life hits them in the face. The way you operate, the way you, and what Ritchhart will call the red thread, and this red thread idea is what we're driving to, that thing is what is really salient about what you do. That red thread drives all your decision making. All of it. It imposes so much in good ways and not so good ways. We can't have it all. We must make decisions. And that is an important thing to remember. I can't do it all. You can't do it all. We must make decisions. And it is those decisions that are important. And looking at the book, looking at the ideas that Ritchhart is giving us, making decisions must be made on fundamental values that you hold dear. And I know we live in a world that imposes upon us all the time. And yet, as Jeremy said weeks ago, an opportunity to make music within the confines of my job. All of us, all of our jobs are confining. Some to a greater extent, some to a lesser extent, but there are limits placed upon us. And even in those limits, we can do so much more to promote a nation of recreational music doers. And that's really what I'm pushing. Instead of hitting the remote, TiVo it and go and make music with your kids. Go and make music with your friends. As I end, and to come full circle, so there's some closure to this mini lecture, technique is important. All disciplines improve technique. And music and dance, to a lesser extent, and theater, I would say music and theater, are possibly the two most self-serving performing arts that we have. We learn technique of acting, the technique of acting to serve the great playwrights on stage. We learn great technique on the oboe to serve great musical composers. And it is a gas to play in an ensemble. I love singing in ensembles. I love singing in my church choir. I love playing, or I loved, past tense, used to could. I loved playing in bands. And yet that isn't for everyone. The way we envision music education is not for everyone. And we have a responsibility for everyone, especially in a day and age when everyone is looking at everyone to cut the budget. There you go. The technique that we impart to children must serve children in any musical context they choose. I'll repeat. The technique we transmit to children must serve children at any time of their life in any musical context they choose, using any musical medium they choose, using any technology that has yet to be invented that they could use to make music in 10 years. If this idea of the world of music education is so, and we don't know what the future for most people is going to be. We know what our future is going to be because it involves oboes and flutes and clarinets and bassoons and saxophones and trumpets and French horns and drums, violins, and because it's existed in the same format for the last 250 years. The world is changing around us. We must change with it. I encourage you to reflect and see how you can think divergently, differently about what you do in your studio to encourage a lifetime of musical activity in any musical style or genre. Something to think about. Bye-bye.